there, and welcome to Murder Most British. I'm Zach.
Hey, welcome. I'm Rachel.
Oh yeah, back again, another week. Here we go.
Yep, we look forward to bringing you these cases every week.
Oh yeah.
Definitely like to discuss them with and hear everybody's opinions on the cases after as well. Any comments are great.
Yeah, especially about this case that is absolutely crazy.
Well, where are we taking them this week?
Going to Kent.
Kent.
Yep, southeast.
Yeah,
of
I've
London.
only been to Kent once.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it was Canterbury, I think it was called. It was like a little fishing town.
You mostly went to Bognor Regis and Skeggy, as you call it.
Yeah, so when we was real young kids we did.
Yeah.
And then it was like up north, sort of Yarmouth, seaside towns like that. Yeah. But Kent, yeah. Kent, when I went there, it was a lovely little place, the fishing town that we went to.
Well, maybe we can go there one day and you can show me.
We'll see.
So before we begin, a small request from us.
If you enjoy listening to our true crime stories, please give us a like, a follow, and a 5-star rating. Also, give us a follow on Instagram, TikTok at Murder Most British, and on Facebook at MMB Podcast.
You can also join us on the public crypt chat, our free Discord channel, where you can talk about cases, share theories, and read the latest news from the archive.
Your support helps us with the archive and helps our archive grow. It ensures also that no story is ever forgotten.
A quick little note before we begin, though. This one is pretty grim.
Trigger warning.
Yeah, kind of like it's, especially because this case involves sexual violence and post-mortem abuse. So if that's not something that you want to listen to, we totally understand, and we will see you in the next episode. So now, let's get to the story.
It begins in the summer of 1987, came warm to Royal Tunbridge Wells in Kent, which is around 30 miles southeast of London. Shops opened onto the scent of cut grass from the common. Buses idled by the War Memorial, and the pavements glowed after rain. Bedsits lined the old terraces near the station, small rooms, thin walls, the hum of late-night televisions behind them. Evenings fell softly, street lamps blinked on, trains sighed towards London. But by midnight, only the odd taxi passed. There was no warning that anything in this quiet order would break. For now, the town is still. The night is listening.
So in the mid-1980s, Tunbridge Wells carried the easy pace of a commuter town. Camden Road, Mount Pleasant, the stretch of the Common, people moved through familiar routines of shops opening, buses pulling in, and neighbors greeting one another on the way to work. Many of the older Victorian houses had been divided into bedsits, the kind of single-room spaces that gave young adults a simple, affordable start in a town that felt orderly and safe. So I was like, what the heck is a bedsit? It's pretty much sort of like a studio apartment is what we would call it. It's just kind of almost like a one room with a little kitchenette and bathroom.
Yeah, the only thing, it was like a 2-room place, basically. So your lounge and bedroom were together, and then and your kitchen, basically, all in one room.
Yeah.
And then just a separate toilet and bathroom.
Yeah.
So, yeah. I think they need more of those. I think we've lost quite a few.
Yeah, something for like single folks that there's a nice, affordable little place that they can start out in.
Yeah, definitely. I think they really are good little places. Wendy Knell, 25, was one of those young adults building life on her own terms. She managed the Super Snaps photo shop on Camden Road. Known at work for being calm, capable and good with customers, not long before the summer of 1987, she settled into a bedsit on Guildford Road, a modest ground floor room off a shared hallway, with a few personal touches and a radio she often kept on in the evenings. Her days unfolded in a steady pattern: work, family visits, and the same familiar walk home through the town centre.
So, a little further north, 20-year-old Caroline Pierce was finding her own independence. She worked late shifts at Buster Brown's restaurant near the town centre, a place where the pace was quick and the regulars lively. Friends remember her as outgoing and sociable, someone who enjoyed the bustle of restaurant work, She lived alone in a small flat in Grosvenor Park, another old house divided into compact units that suited young workers making their own way. Making their way down. Sorry. I'm sorry. Every single time that I ever hear making their way, that's the song comes into my head. And then from watching Critical Role,
Yep.
every time Matt would say, you make your way down, they're like, making my way down.
Break into song.
Yeah. Anyway, so her flat sat just off the busier Mount Ephraim area, where pubs and late night venues meant people often walked home after midnight.
Well, Wendy and Caroline never met, but they lived within the same small patch of Tunbridge Wells. Their paths crossed the same shop fronts and quiet streets, each of them moving through neighbourhoods that the local papers treated as ordinary and uneventful, places where people expected the days and the nights to pass without trouble.
So, born in 1954, David Fuller grew up as a quiet, technically minded child, the kind who liked, fiddling with radios and electrical bits. By his late teens and early 20s, Fuller was already on the police radar, though. In the early 1970s, he was convicted of burglaries described at the time as so-called creeper burglaries, and further break-ins followed in the mid-1970s. He avoided prison, and on the surface, his life settled back into something that looked ordinary. That's a weird thing, creeper burglaries.
Yeah, I mean, is that basically...
Is he like peeping-tomming?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Like,
and all that.
That's how I would assume he was, what he was doing.
He's a creeping around.
Creeper. Strange. Well, he trained as an electrician, earning City and Guilds qualifications and working steady jobs across Kent and East Sussex. There's nothing in the police record from these years. His work revolved around routine maintenance and repairs, the kind of jobs that rely on reliability rather than attention.
Yeah, that's a good job. Not easy doing all that and getting those qualifications.
It's a good paid job.
Yeah.
Once you've got your qualifications, it's one of the highest paid jobs that you could have.
So in his 20s, he married, got divorced, and later remarried. His second wife, Sally, he settled in Heathfield, East Sussex. Neighbors would later describe him as polite, soft-spoken, and someone who cycled often, helped with small repairs, and kept a neat workshop full of tools and electrical parts. On the surface, his life was quiet and domestic, without a hint of volatility.
Photography grew into one of his main hobbies. Fuller carried a camera on family outings and cycling trips, stopped into camera shops around town, including the Super Snaps where Wendy worked. And in 1985, even accompanied briefly with the band Cutting Crew, known for the song I Just Died in Your Arms Tonight.
I just died in your arms tonight.
It's a good song. It's a bloody good song.
It is really good.
Well, Fuller was an informal tour photographer. To people who met him, he was simply a quiet man with a camera.
Man, that sounds pretty good. He's got a wife, got a nice place, got a good job, running around with Cutting Crew back in the 80s.
Yeah.
Woo, doggy. That'd be crazy.
That would be good, wouldn't it?
Well, work took him in and around Tunbridge Wells through the mid-1980s. As an electrician, he moved through service corridors, storerooms, and maintenance areas without attracting much notice. Colleagues later described him as reliable, the kind of tradesman who quietly got on with things.
Well, by early 1987, Fuller's life sat in a pattern that drew no attention. He and his wife were based in Heathfield. He travelled to the jobs in Tunbridge Wells, and he carried his camera as habitually as a set of tools. Neighbours saw a man who worked, went home and kept to himself. The wider town moved at its usual pace, unaware that someone within its everyday circuits had already lived a very different kind of past.
On the night of the 22nd of June, 1987, moving into the early hours of the 23rd, 25-year-old Wendy Knell followed the pattern of a completely ordinary day. She had spent the afternoon managing the Super Snaps shop, serving customers, processing film, locking up at closing time. After work, she met her boyfriend, and the two spent the evening together before he took her home on his motorbike at around 11 p.m. Nothing about the night raised any kind of concern. No unusual visitors, no reported disturbances, just another warm June evening in a quiet corner of the town.
After her boyfriend had dropped her off home, Wendy headed inside and locked her door behind her. The shared hallway stayed quiet through the night. No neighbours reported footsteps, voices, or anything out of place. From that moment that she returned home, the building offered no further sign of movement from her flat.
Sometime after she returned home, an intruder entered Wendy's bedsit. There were no signs of forced entry, and the attack happened in the confined space around her bed. She was struck with serious force, sexually assaulted, and strangled. The assault was swift and violent, carried out in the early hours while the town around her slept. When the attacker left, the flat fell silent again, and the night carried on without anyone realizing what had taken place behind the closed door.
The following morning, Wendy had failed to turn up for her shift at Super Snaps. Staff tried to reach her, and concern quickly spread. Shortly before 11 a.m, her mother phoned Wendy's boyfriend, who had left work immediately and went to the flat. Unable to get inside, he looked through a window, saw her motionless body on the bed. He raised the alarm at a nearby fire station. Emergency crews arrived, but nothing could be done. Police sealed off the flat and began the slow, methodical work of documenting every part of the scene.
So inside, the officers moved carefully. The bloodstained bedding was removed for analysis. A millet carrier bag inside the room held a fingerprint left in blood, and a blood shoe print was documented on a blouse found nearby. Early forensic traces that would later become central to the case, fibers, hairs, and all recoverable material were collected and sealed. What they gathered painted a picture of a sudden, intense attack carried out by someone who left almost nothing behind except the violence itself.
By early afternoon, Wendy's body was taken to the local hospital mortuary for further examination. Outside, Guildford Road returned to an uneasy quiet. Neighbours moved cautiously along the pavement. Officers went door to door, and the news spread through the town. No one yet knew that what had happened in that small bedsit would be the beginning of a much larger and darker story.
So, 5 months later, on the 24th of November 1987, 20-year-old Caroline Pierce finished a late shift at Buster Brown's restaurant, where she worked near Tunbridge Wells town center. Shortly before midnight, she phoned for a minicab. At 11:49 p.m., a Starline Taxis driver collected her, and around 11:55 p.m., he dropped her at her entrance to her flat in Grosvenor Park. Caroline stepped out of the taxi and towards her building. That was the last confirmed sighting of her alive.
A short time later, neighbours reported hearing a woman scream. First a brief, high-pitched cry, then a second, louder scream that lasted several seconds. Another resident, looking from a window, saw the taxi that had dropped her off pause for a moment before reversing slightly to turn and drive away. After that, the street fell quiet again. No signs of a struggle were seen from outside, and no one witnessed what happened next. Caroline did not reach her doorway.
By the next morning, concern grew quickly. Caroline failed to appear for her shift, and colleagues realized that she had not been seen since leaving work the night before. Attempts to contact her led nowhere. She was reported missing, and when police checked her bedsit, they found no indication she had returned home after being dropped off. Within hours, the situation shifted from a simple absence to a suspected disappearance.
A search began that afternoon. Tunbridge Wells was already unsettled by Wendy Knell's murder earlier that year, and the sudden disappearance of another young woman from another bedsit sent a deep unease through the town. Officers and volunteers searched the common, footpaths, and nearby streets, but nothing emerged. Her flat remained sealed. Days passed with no breakthrough, and the town braced itself for the worst.
Well, unfortunately, the worst came, because on the 15th of December, 3 weeks after she had vanished, a farm worker near St. Mary in the Marsh, more than 40 miles from Tunbridge Wells, noticed something in the drainage ditch. Police arrived and identified Caroline's body. Some of her clothing was nearby, and the disturbed ground suggested how she had been left at the isolated scene. It was clear she had been killed shortly after her abduction.
A post-mortem confirmed the violence she had suffered: sexual assault and strangulation. mirroring the injuries inflicted on Wendy Knell just months earlier. In the exposed winter marshland, investigators collected every item they could recover: fragments of clothing, soil, vegetation, knowing that whatever lay in that ditch might hold the best chance of linking the two cases.
Yeah, it definitely felt like this is the start of like a serial killer.
I think they definitely kind of could link that these two deaths were very similar. Obviously,
they were not far.
Yeah, obviously Caroline's not been found in her bedsit like Wendy, but the manner of deaths and stuff are very similar, and they're quite close proximity to each other. So you would assume that they would look into having a possible link.
Yeah. But I would also, as the police, I'd be like, oh no, this could be like a serial killer starting to start their pattern.
Yeah.
And start killing, and more people are going to get killed. But as word of the discovery traveled back to Tunbridge Wells, the community felt the weight of the confirmation. What had begun as a disappearance now stood as a second murder, bound by method, timing, and circumstance to the first. Whatever sense of safety had returned after the summer was gone. The town understood that someone capable of extraordinary violence had moved through its streets more than once and had disappeared again without a trace.
The path to answers didn't begin with Caroline's disappearance. It began months earlier with Wendy Knell. The morning after Wendy was found murdered in her bedsit, Kent police opened a full incident room and laid out the first hard facts. A 25-year-old woman sexually assaulted and strangled, with no weapon recovered. Detectives started with the essentials: locking down the scene, collecting exhibits, and establishing her final movements. Her boyfriend, questioned immediately, was quickly eliminated as a suspect.
Yeah, they always go after the partner first.
Yeah, I think statistically,
That's always a good place to
sadly, a
start.
lot of it is by people you know. So it's best to start at the closest people and branch your way out.
Yeah.
In an investigation. So, yeah, that doesn't surprise me.
Yeah. Well, then officers also conducted door-to-door inquiries along Guildford Road and the surrounding streets, gathering small observations from residents. Lights that had been on later than usual, the sound of someone moving about in an upstairs flat, the ordinary creaks and settling noises of an old building. People shared what they could remember, but nothing pointed to an intrusion or a moment of violence.
Across the 23rd and 24th of June, the flat was examined in slow, deliberate passes. The blood-stained bedding was lifted from the bed. A carrier bag bearing a bloody fingerprint was collected, and a blood shoe print was documented on an item of her clothing. Fibres, hairs, and traces left in the room were gathered piece by piece, each one stored away, and as the wider picture of that night began to take shape.
Detectives began tracing the shape of Wendy's life, following her routines and the people who moved through her days. Staff at Super Snaps were spoken to, regular customers noted, closing times fixed in place. Possibilities were explored in widening circles: burglary, obsession, someone from her past, someone already known to the police. Names were pinned to the incident board, then taken back down as alibis held. Despite the effort, no single line pointed forward. The picture remained stubbornly still.
It must have been frustrating, innit?
Yeah. That's like, you're just thinking, oh, okay, well, it's probably this guy, and it's just each one. Nope. And you're just like, oh man, like, how are we going to find this guy?
Just trying to find that right lead to pinpoint you towards a potentially 100% this is our suspect.
Yeah.
We need to gather enough evidence on this person. But yeah, it's hard work, what they do.
Yeah.
But the police are always determined to...
Oh, they ain't going to stop.
No, which is great. Well, Caroline's disappearance in November and the grim discovery in December cast a new and unsettling shape over the investigation. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Two young women living alone in small ground floor bedsits, both attacked with the same violence. Their addresses separated by barely a mile. The distance between her abduction in Grosvenor Park and the marsh where she was found pointed to someone who drove, someone who could slip out of Tunbridge Wells unnoticed. Detectives linked the two cases quietly, keeping the connection within the walls of the investigation.
Well, Caroline's bedsit offered almost nothing back. The room was undisturbed. The doorway was giving up only a few faint marks in the gravel outside, too slight to show direction or meaning. The real silence lay 40 miles away in the Romney Marsh. There, in the wide, exposed landscape, investigators moved carefully through the secondary scene, tracing the position of her body and the shape of the ground around it. Soil fragments of vegetation and the smallest impressions were gathered and taken for testing. None of it pointed to a person or a vehicle. The path the perpetrator had taken remained lost in the open country.
With two murders now linked by method and circumstance, Kent police pulled the inquiries together. A combined team worked through both case files side by side, looking for patterns in movement, opportunity, and behaviour. What emerged suggested a single offender, someone who appeared to be able to move through familiar residential streets without drawing attention. But when those traits were measured against the names already known to police, none of them fit. The investigation widened, yet no figure stepped cleanly into view.
Forensic science in the late 1980s could narrow possibilities but not name an unknown killer. Analysts built what they could: blood groupings, semen characteristics, enzyme profiles, enough to eliminate several men but not enough to isolate one. Every piece of physical evidence, from swabs and fibers to soil and clothing, was sealed and stored in the hope that future techniques might succeed where current methods stalled. The inquiry pressed on, but the science of the time could only take it so far.
Through the early 1990s, the investigation moved in along repeating loops. Fresh eyes returned to old statements, sifted through the boxes of preserved exhibits, and looked outward to other regions for offenders whose behaviour might cast a new light on the case. A handful of men were spoken to more than once, then quietly set aside when the evidence didn't hold. What the inquiry gathered in those years was not momentum but paperwork. Layer after layer, and still no one who could be placed at either scene.
By the mid-1990s, the case had slipped into stillness. The evidence remained sealed and intact, the files kept in full, but the trail itself had thinned to almost nothing. Locally, the names of Wendy Knell and Caroline Pierce stayed alive in memory. Nationally, the story had drifted out of sight. Detectives held to the belief that someone, somewhere, knew the missing piece. But without new science or a fresh lead, the man who killed them remained out of reach.
That would have been heartbreaking for their families to not know, get a good
It's going on years. You're thinking,
conviction.
they're going to catch him in days, and it's gone on years and years.
Mm.
It's heartbreaking.
Devastating. It's a bit like missing people, isn't it? And you've just got no closure, no understanding of who did this and why they did it.
Yeah.
Yeah, very sad. But luckily, by the late 1990s and early 2000s, forensic science was evolving to outpace the era in which Wendy and Caroline were killed. Detectives pulled the old exhibits from storage, the duvet from Guildford Road, the preserved samples from Grosvenor Park, and sent them back to laboratories equipped with techniques that hadn't existed in 1987. The evidence had survived in remarkable condition, saved by the careful paper packaging and stable storage of the time. After more than a decade, the traces were ready to be heard again.
Yeah, like I was reading about it. It's like a lot of times, a lot of those samples are degraded because they weren't stored properly. And they were amazed how good the samples were kept and stored. And it was like a gift. It was like, holy cow, really?
Yeah. I mean, that's really good because obviously, it doesn't matter how much time goes by. If they can be stored correctly, there's, like they say, DNA and forensics are going to just constantly evolve. So, the better the sample preservation, the better.
Yeah, definitely. Because from that renewed testing came the first real movement in years. An enhanced male DNA profile developed from evidence at Wendy's scene. Later testing found the same profile linked to Caroline's case. It offered a scientific confirmation that both women had been killed by the same man, but they couldn't get the name of the man. When the profile was run through the Young National DNA Database, No match appeared. No name, no history, only the outline of someone who had stepped into both women's lives and vanished again.
He wasn't on the database there.
It was pretty young at the time, and they
Yeah.
didn't have all of it set up.
Mm.
They didn't have all of it connect. Like, you'd have some places that would have their own DNA database, but they weren't all centrally connected.
Right. It wasn't all linked. I mean, this person's DNA could have been on the system, but in a different county.
Yeah,
Yeah.
possibly.
Well, into the early 2000s, the investigation kept circling back to those fragments. Cold case reviews revisited every angle: the statements, the timelines, the preserved fibres and prints. New officers brought new eyes, and each technological shift prompted another look at the evidence. The shape of the offender grew sharper in theory, but the one crucial piece, the name that would anchor everything, had stayed missing.
So a major review in 2007 drew both murders together officially. Yeah, I mean, they had the DNA, but specialists confirmed the DNA link and described the offender plainly: a sexually motivated stranger who had slipped through every system since 1987. The DNA profile was run again through the national databases, now much larger, broader, and more complete. Once again, nothing. The same silent profile, the same absence of any relative or connection.
As the 2010s unfolded, labs pushed the limits of what could be done with small or aging samples. Each advance produced a cleaner version of the same partial profile, but never enough to complete it. The man remained present in the evidence, but unseen in the world, a shadow without a match.
Well, so like the detectives were like, we got to keep going. And this is where we always say, they don't stop.
No.
They're not. New cops come in, they say, let's have fresh eyes on this.
I think the only thing that is, obviously they're limited to how much evidence DNA evidence they've got. There will come a point of keep retesting that they may run out of the DNA samples.
Yeah, I think that with this one, it was like each team contributed something that kept building that file.
Yeah, progressed it slightly, no matter, even though it was a slow progressions, it still progressed in some way, which is great.
Yeah. So they kept revisiting men of interest. Those who lived near the Bedsits in 1987, those later convicted of serious offenses, those flagged in other inquiries. New DNA samples were taken where possible. One by one, those men were ruled out. The investigation didn't grow through new leads, it narrowed through elimination.
By the mid-2010s, the case had settled into an uneasy stalemate. The evidence was intact, the link between the murders unshakable, but the offender remained untethered to any known profile. Perhaps he'd moved, died, or simply never crossed the system in a way that left a trace. 2 killings, 1 DNA pattern, and still no name.
And it's the same thing. You get up to 90s, 2000, 2010s. You've got all this stuff, no name. It's just so elusive. And I would be so frustrated as one. I'd just be like, we have it. If we can just find the guy and get the sample, we've got him. And you just can't find him. So as the decades grew on, a new possibility emerged: familial DNA searching. It had begun solving some of the country's most difficult cases, identifying offenders through relatives rather than direct matches. It required a specialist approval and significant resources, a tool used sparingly, but with extraordinary potential. And though the paperwork behind the scenes was quiet, Kent police had begun preparing for it.
And so, by the end of 2019, the investigation approached a new threshold. Decades-old evidence preserved in full, a partial DNA profile held in national systems, and a new technology finally capable of closing the distance between a genetic fragment and the man who had left it behind.
By early 2020, 33 years had passed since the 2 murders, and the investigation had narrowed to a single remaining hope: the idea that the killer's identity might be hiding in the DNA of someone related to him. The preserved samples from 1987 were still strong enough to be used. And with that backing of the National Crime Agency, Kent police authorized a search not for the man himself, but for a relative whose details were already in the system.
Yeah, see, there's always going to be one in your family that's, got their name on the
a
police
black sheep.
database, so I don't think with this familial DNA system that they use, I think it's amazing because, there's going to come to a time where there's no crime that you're going to be able to commit and not be caught. No matter how long it takes for them to, investigate and figure it out, there's routes that they're going to take where they can find you.
Now. It's getting there now to where, like,
especially with this
DNA.
Familial DNA.
Unless you're suited and booted in some plastic and all that.
Yeah, exactly.
But even then, you're going to mess up.
Yeah, 100%.
Criminals always think that they're smarter.
Yeah, they're not.
That's, and it's like, you have a whole team of crime scene people and detectives and all this shit. Their combined intelligence, they're gonna find you.
Exactly. All these experts, in these fields of investigating and forensics, and even the amazing how, people that check the vegetation and stuff and soil samples and doing all of that type of forensics, we look at a piece of mud and we're like, well, this just looks mud to me.
Yep, that's mud.
But they can tell where this mud can come from, what type of place this plant lives in, It's amazing. Well, the analysis delivered one promising lead, not a name, but a family line. From that, detectives began tracing the branches outwards. Households, addresses, movements across decades. Men were set aside as ages, locations, and direct comparison ruled them out. Slowly, the tree narrowed to a single possibility. David Fuller, 66, living quietly in Heathfield. A man who had worked in Tunbridge Wells during the years of the murders. And though he had minor convictions from the 1970s, they predated the DNA profiling, meaning no sample had ever been taken from him. His name appeared nowhere in the national database.
Got him. Oh, wait, not yet. So detectives quietly prepared their approach, observing Fuller's routines and gathering the necessary evidence. But before moving in, once detectives were ready to approach him, they visited Fuller and obtained a DNA sample. When it was compared with the profile held since 1987, it matched exactly. The kind of quiet turning point no one outside the investigation could see coming. That's where I'd be like cheering in the detective room, like, oh, we got him.
I mean, how they would have, sort of approached it, knowing full well, that we've got the man, and just trying to sort of stay professional,
But we got you.
Yeah. Nice quiet cheer outside the interview room.
Yep.
The answer arrived quietly. The DNA matched the profile locked in evidence since 1987, closing a gap that had lasted half a lifetime. At last, the man behind the samples was known. The arrest was set in motion immediately.
In the early hours of the 3rd of December 2020, officers went to Fuller's home on Smallfield Road. He answered the door without confusion or struggle, as if waking to nothing more than an unexpected knock. His wife was beside him as detectives led him away, the neighbors peering out through the curtains and half-open blinds. It looked like a quiet man in work clothes being taken into the night. Nothing to hint at the weight of what had finally caught up with him.
I wonder if his wife knew at this point. Well, inside the house, search teams began working through the rooms where Fuller kept his tools, papers, and personal items. At first glance, it felt like any other homicide search. Boxes of odds and sods, shelves, electronics, neatly arranged disks and hard drives waiting to be carried out. Everything looked orderly, almost mundane. No one yet realised, though, what those drives held or how far the story lay from ending.
Yeah, you thought it was bad. It's only going to get worse. Oh, God.
And the story is going to get a little bit more darker.
Yeah, because I thought, they got him. He murdered these two lovely young women. They've got him. What else is there going to be? Oh, well. The investigators began opening the first folders. The room changed. The drives didn't hold spreadsheets or repair logs. They held images, thousands of them. Footage of David Fuller in mortuary rooms, moving through the spaces as if they were his own. The earliest file was from at least 2008, the most recent from 2020. Many of the women were identifiable by their hospital tags. The material showed him entering the rooms, arranging the bodies, and committing acts no one had imagined when the dryers were first lifted from his workshop. Oh.
As the files were examined, the scale of what Fuller had done became stark. Timestamps were layered against years of mortuary records from the Kent and Sussex Hospital and the Tunbridge Wells Hospital in Pembury. The pattern was unmistakable. At least 100 victims across 12 years, ranging from a 9-year-old girl to women who had lived more than a century. Nothing like it had ever been uncovered in the history of UK criminal investigations before.
Ugh. I'll steal the word from you.
Horrendous.
Grim. Oh.
You know, that's just such a terrible thing to happen to these victims.
Yeah. You would think, you've lost a family member and they're down in the mortuary and you think, oh, well, they're at peace now and all that. And then this happens.
Absolutely horrific.
Oh. Well, the news of what had been found reshaped the entire inquiry. Kent police expanded their work overnight, focusing on identifying the women in the images, supporting families, and making sense of the vast digital archive now in their possession. The Maidstone and Tunbridge Wells NHS Trust was informed, and senior officers would later describe the discovery as one of the most devastating moments of their careers. As the search widened, more devices were carried out of the house.
Yeah, I think for the officers, because they have to view this horrendous stuff.
Yeah.
It's just absolutely horrific.
Mm.
Fuller was questioned about both the 1987 murders and the offences shown in the recordings. He gave little away, offering no real explanation for anything he had done. But by mid-December, prosecutors authorised charges, 2 counts of murder, and a series of charges relating to the sexual penetration of a corpse. Fuller was held in custody as the case moved towards court.
By the time the case files reached the Crown Prosecution Service, they spanned more than 30 years, 2 murders, and a catalog of offenses that no one expected to find. As the van carried David Fuller to his first court appearance, one of Britain's longest-running unsolved murder investigations finally reached the moment detectives had been waiting for.
David Fuller's first court appearance came in December 2020, but the real proceedings unfolded later at Maidstone Crown Court. By late 2021, he was 67 years old, standing in the dock for the murders of Wendy Knell and Caroline Pierce, and for multiple mortuary offences that scarcely hinted at the scale of what investigators had uncovered. The courtroom, usually a space for contested stories, was now preparing to confront a life that had turned darkness into routine.
Fuller began by denying murder, offering pleas to manslaughter instead, attempting to cast the killings as the result of diminished responsibility. But the Crown stood firm. The DNA that matched him to both scenes, the preserved forensic traces from 1987, the vast digital archive taken from his home, told a very different story. The trial pressed on.
Standing before the jury, the prosecution unfolded the narrative that he had taken decades to assemble. They spoke of the 2 women whose murders had haunted Tunbridge Wells since 1987, and of the science that had finally drawn a single thread between them. They described a man who had lived one life in public, steady, quiet, dependable, and another in private, built on secrecy and control. The murders, they argued, were not a break from his character, but the earliest glimpse of it.
The defense soon saw the direction of travel. The diminished responsibility argument was withdrawn, and within days of the jury being sworn, Fuller changed his plea to guilty on both murder counts. The trial suddenly was no longer about proof. It became about truth, and how much of it the court would hear. The prosecution continued, outlining categories of mortuary offending rather than images, giving shape to the hidden life uncovered in his home.
When the digital archive was formally described, the courtroom fell into a heavy stillness. Thousands of images and videos showed Fuller abusing bodies in the mortuaries of the Kent and Sussex Hospital and later Tunbridge Wells Hospital at Pembury. The material spanned more than a decade, from at least the late 2000s through to 2020. Analysts explained how he had arranged the footage in named folders, cataloguing victims with dates and meticulous detail. By the time of sentencing in 2021, investigators had formally identified 78 women and girls, with police warning that the true number of victims was likely to exceed 100. Fuller entered guilty pleas to the mortuary offences placed before him.
During the sentencing submissions, prosecutor Duncan Atkinson, KC, described Fuller's existence as a double life. One half so ordinary it blended into the fabric of the town, then the other hidden in places no one imagined needed protection. The 1987 killings, he argued, were the beginning of that pattern. The mortuary offenses were its continuation, depraved, disgusting, and dehumanizing on a scale that has never been encountered before in legal history, as one prosecutor later put it. The defense offered little in return. His age, his cooperation after arrest, his acceptance of guilt. None of it softened the weight of what had been revealed. I don't care how old you are, how cooperative you are, you go die in prison. Goodbye.
Absolutely horrendous. The crimes that he's committed, and then they're two completely different sorts of crimes as well. He resulted to murder back in 1987, and then to kind of change his ammo.
Yeah, I think he was killing them and then doing this act.
Yeah.
Because that's necrophilia, that type of thing.
Which is what I'm saying.
Like,
and then,
hey, let's go work at a hospital in the mortuary.
Which I think was his way of being able to do what he wanted to do, but without all the hard work of killing. It's absolutely horrendous, this case.
Yeah, it reminded me of the monster that I'd Gein. When he's telling the girl, "You're too warm," put her in an ice bath. Gross. Ugh.
On 15th of December 2021, Mrs. Justice Chi McGrubb delivered her sentence. She said Fuller's actions represented the deepest corruption of the human spirit and an almost indescribable wickedness, emphasising not only on the brutality of the murders but the betrayal of trust that had allowed him access to the mortuaries. She imposed 2 whole life orders, guaranteeing he would never leave prison, alongside concurrent terms for the mortuary offences, described in court as the largest set of post-mortem sexual crimes ever brought before a British court.
Family members of Wendy, Knell, and Caroline Pierce were there to hear the final words. Their statements spoke of decades of grief, the unanswered questions, and the fresh wounds opened by the mortuary revelations. Outside, senior officers acknowledged the length of the investigation and the extraordinary harm borne by the families of the living and the deceased victims.
And when Fuller was led below the court, the hearing drew to a quiet close. There had been no dramatic final argument, no competing version of events, only the formal sealing of guilt across 2 separate spans of time. The murders that had haunted Tunbridge Wells since 1987 and the hidden crimes carried out in silence for more than a decade.
When the courtroom finally emptied, the consequences of David Fuller's crimes continued to ripple outward. In late 2021, before the public had even begun to absorb the scale of his offending, the health secretary announced an independent inquiry, a recognition that these facts had not only been committed, but had been possible. The question was no longer who David Fuller was, but how he had gone unseen for so long.
Yeah, I think I read that there was a certain part in the mortuary where there was no cameras, and obviously,
yeah, he's going to find them blind spots to where he can do his sick shit.
Yeah, and get away with it.
Yeah, fucking disgusting.
The inquiry, chaired by Sir Jonathan Michael, unfolded in 2 stages. Phase 1 examined the Maidstone and Tunbridge Wells NHS Trust, focusing on the everyday systems around Fuller during the years that he worked there. Its report, published in November of 2023, was stark: weak oversight of contractors, inadequate control of mortuary access, and supervision that relied too heavily on habit and assumption. When the findings were released, the Trust issued an unreserved apology, condemning Fuller's actions as depraved and calculated, and pledging immediate reform. I should bloody well hope so. You know?
Yeah, you need to have more oversight. You need to have more.
I think that, to be fair, I mean, he was an electrician, so he was in there as an electrician. But there should always be two people. I've said this working on a bar, there should always be two people as a safety precaution, not just because, to make sure that there's somebody there, but as a witness that everything was kosher with people's acts, and there should always be two people at one time entering places, especially like that.
But also finding them blind spots and finding places that people, because you're not always, like you say, you're not always going to have someone there.
Yeah.
And you're going to have a guy by himself.
Yeah.
But you shouldn't have those blind spots.
I think this is the thing. I think this is the naivety of people sometimes, where they don't think of, these types of things possibly happening. Obviously, it's so unreal, these types of crimes, that you really wouldn't think that someone would do that, but I think you also have to have...
I think that we don't think about these things because we don't think about doing those things. So we're not like, hey, make sure those bodies are cool and that nobody's going to come in and do horrific things to them. You just think, oh, well, they're sealed, they're in the mortuary, they're safe, and at peace.
Yeah.
You don't think that someone's going to do that. But with these changes that we were talking about, they followed quickly. Plans were set for the mortuary CCTV coverage, tighter access controls, strengthening DBS checks, background checks, and clearer rules on who could enter restricted areas and when. So even if they were an electrician or maintenance man or whatever,
like
you said, they need to be supervised. They need to have someone there to make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. But NHS England confirmed that these improvements would be monitored closely as they were put in place. It was the rebuilding of a system that should never have been allowed to fail.
100%. And, it's just tragic that people out there choose to do these types of things in the first place. But definitely great that they brought into, they became aware that some weirdo was kind of going out doing this shit, and they were able to then implement procedures to tighten them.
Yeah, and quickly.
Yeah. Well, then came phase 2. Published in July 2025, the focus widened beyond Kent, reaching into hospitals, funeral directors, ambulance services, and local authority mortuaries, anywhere that the deceased might rest. The findings were sobering. Protections across England were inconsistent, incomplete, and in some settings entirely absent.
Oh, Jesus.
Dozens of recommendations followed, including proposals for statutory regulation of the funeral sector and a national overhaul of how the deceased are safeguarded.
Good. Jeez. That's crazy.
That's the other thing. Yeah, you don't think about funeral directors and, they have access to, which takes me back to, obviously there should be CCTV, but there should also be, two people attending at a time, so then you're supervising each other to make sure that you're doing the correct procedures.
You don't want one guy just by himself.
Yeah.
Or girl, whatever, but goodness gracious. So the regulators responded quickly. The Human Tissue Authority announced plans to expand its oversight and tighten inspection standards, extending scrutiny into areas that had previously fallen outside its remit. The aim was simple, but urgent, to ensure that what happened in Kent could not happen elsewhere. It was reform driven by necessity, not by ambition.
Well, meanwhile, the criminal investigation had not ended with Fuller's sentencing. As analysts continued examining his digital archive, additional victims were identified. In late 2022, Fuller faced further charges relating to mortuary offences committed over many years. By the time police and inquiry teams completed their work, they had confirmed at least 101 deceased victims and documented around 140 acts. A dedicated compensation and support scheme was established through NHS resolution, working alongside Kent Police family liaison officers to support the relatives of those formerly identified.
Good God, that's crazy. Ugh. Well, across the NHS and the wider funeral sector, the message that followed was unambiguous. Dignity, security, and oversight must continue long after death. Hospitals and mortuaries across the country re-examined how staff moved through secured spaces, how contractors were monitored, and how digital trails could be strengthened. At Tunbridge Wells Hospital and the former site it replaced, access routes were reconsidered, lighting improved, signage updated, and after-hours entry tightened.
For the families of Wendy Knell and Caroline Pierce, the case closed with a mixture of long-awaited certainty and wounds no one could have foreseen. The identification of the killer brought an end to decades of unanswered questions, but the mortuary revelations added a different kind of grief, darker, more complex, and impossible to separate from the justice that finally arrived.
In Tunbridge Wells, the places touched by the case remain unchanged in appearance. The quiet terraces, the former bedsits, the hospital corridors, yet their meanings have shifted. Residents speak of a town that learned its vulnerability slowly, realizing that one man's access and anonymity had allowed him to flourish behind locked doors.
Yeah. What endures is a commitment to vigilance. Mortuary security has been strengthened, oversight rebuilt, and national standards reimagined. Fuller's case stands not only as a criminal reckoning, but is a turning point, a reminder that protection does not end with life, and that the systems entrusted with safeguarding the vulnerable must guard them in every moment that follows.
Ooh, goodness gracious. That was the story of the Bedsit murders and David Fuller and all the horrific shit he did.
That guy is absolutely horrendous.
The
and
American
lifelong stuff.
The American in me is coming out with just put a bullet in his head. Like this, and it's the enraging. You just get so enraged. You're just like, this guy just should not live.
It's a hard one, isn't it? Because, there's obviously, it's quite easy to think, yep, let's just, death sentence and be done with it.
Yeah.
But then for victims, is that justice? A lot of people that go through these crimes and are victims of some horrendous stuff actually like to know that they're in prison. They like the idea that they're alive, but they can't enjoy life. They can't go out and do the things that they used to do before, of having a coffee in a coffee shop, or, just a normal life.
That he's not retired and on a pension and enjoying his life.
But then again, I think prisons have got a little bit too soft over here. They've got things, TVs, for God's sake. You know what I mean? Why they should be,
well,
prison should be a pure punishment.
Well, I think it's more of like, you can have a TV or whatever, but it is kind of relaxed but I more think of like the punishment. We just did the House of Blood, and they brutally murdered those people and only got a dozen years, 13 years or whatever, and as a minimum. They have to go to the parole board and all that. But then the son got, John got out.
Yeah.
And then he got to, this is where it comes up to, can people be rehabilitated?
I think it's more a case-by-case basis and the type of crime that they've committed. I personally don't believe that sexual offenders can change. I don't believe that they can be rehabilitated. That's just my view, my opinion.
There's certain people who have certain proclivities.
A burglar,
like David Fuller. He obviously had a proclivity for dead people and that horrific shit. You can't change. Like, he did that for years and years and years.
I think when it comes to severe crimes, from historical cases that you kind of read about, learn about, they go on to commit again. So which instills my belief that they cannot be rehabilitated. If they've committed such a serious offence, they are more likely to do it again. It's like, a little kid, look at a kid, touches a fire. Do you think they're going to do it again? No, because they've hurt themselves. But if they're, if you've committed something that's absolutely horrendous even once, clearly you've done it for a reason, and you've done it because you actually don't care. You wanted to do what you wanted to do.
Yeah.
And I think that the mindset can't be changed. I think that's in them.
Yeah.
Whereas a burglar or a shoplifter, they do that for 9 times out of 10, it's a need. Maybe they're homeless and don't have...
Yeah, like an economic thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Whereas something similar.
Murdering somebody, it's the same. It's different to driving your car and you have an accident and kill somebody that way,
But even with that, you have like murders, like crimes of passion that you just get, but like people that premeditated,
I think if
they wanted to do it, they went out and did it. There's a difference there.
Yeah, I agree. I think that if there's an intention to, in what you've committed a murder and you've intended to do that, then you're not going to be rehabilitated. You're going to highly likely do it again. Whereas if it was by an accident, now you can punch somebody once and you could actually, they could die just from one punch.
Like that one kid that somebody punched him, he fell over and he hit his head on the curb
exactly.
and died.
I don't think that intention for that person to die was there.
Yeah.
It was just they're thinking about fighting. It's not about, I'm going to kill you,
Yeah, just having a punch up.
Exactly. So I think it's all about the intention.
Yeah.
Whether that's there or not.
Well, this old boy, this was his intention, and he's sitting in prison forever. Well, till he's dead.
He's just ruined so many people's lives.
Especially with all the people.
And even his own family's lives.
Yeah, but also all the people that they had to be contacted to let them know that, hey, we have all this evidence, against this guy that he was doing nasty shit.
You would never dream to have a call like that.
Your dead relative. Yeah, or dead loved one. Yeah, but anyways.
Well, thank you for listening to this tough episode this week. If you would like to support the work that we do here in the archive, please take a moment to follow the show and leave us a 5-star rating. It helps others to discover the stories that we tell and keeps the archive growing. Sharing the podcast with someone who loves true crime also makes a huge difference.
Yeah, share it around. Please, thank you. You can also follow us on TikTok and Instagram at Murder Most British and on Facebook at MMB Podcast. If you want, you could join us in the Discord, the public crypt chat. You can get updates from the archive from there as well.
Yep, and everything you need, socials, Discord, and more, is in our link tree down below.
So, until next time, stay safe and stay curious.
Take care.